In 2006, from the moment they released, Pokémon Diamond and Pearl became legendary. Physical special split, online trading, the most advanced Pokémon lore yet. Now these games were far from perfect, just ask the Blissey that I close combated 20 years ago, but they revolutionized the series in many ways that are still relevant today. But after 15 more years of innovations and evolutions in the series, in 2021, Pokémon fans asked Game Freak one simple question: can you just remake this, but a little bit better? And Game Freak's answer was, what if we didn't? We all know by now, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were not the bold, reinventive remakes that many fans had dreamed of, similar to Heart Gold and Soul Silver or Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Instead, they ended up being the most cautious and least ambitious remakes in the entire series, polishing some aspects of Diamond and Pearl, but feeling frustratingly frozen in time in many others. Faithful to a fault, if you will. But what if I told you that all of that was kinda on accident? Let's start from the beginning. Pokémon had been remaking titles for quite some time already, with 4 remakes preceding Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl's development. 2 of them taking place in the exact same region. Fire Red and Leaf Green were relatively conservative remakes that just sought to update the original Generation 1 games to the series' new standards, especially since a lot of the mechanics and Pokémon sprite designs in the original games left a lot to be desired. Sorry, Upside Down Coughing, you know it's true. But they also served another purpose, as with the transition from the Game Boy Color to the Game Boy Advance, old Pokémon were no longer transferable due to incompatibility issues between the two systems. And this was back in my day when we had flip phones and Charlie Bit My Finger. There was no Pokémon Bank or Pokémon Home to bail them out. So, since more than 180 Pokémon were locked out of Ruby and Sapphire, Fire Red and Leaf Green had a practical aspect to them too, where you could basically get all the Pokémon that weren't available in Hoenn and trade them over. After an incredibly long and tedious series of missions in the Sevi Islands. Thanks, Game Freak, that was so awesome of you. And the same kinda rings true for the next pair of remakes, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, as they likewise needed to update the outdated mechanics of Gen 2, but also Johto was now the only region not playable on the Nintendo DS, since backwards compatibility to Game Boy Color games was phased out. These remakes, unlike Fire Red and Leaf Green, which really only buffed up the post-game, included a litany of changes to the main story to make them feel more like Crystal remakes than Gold and Silver remakes. Which makes complete and total sense. Logically, you would base the remakes off of the previously superior enhanced version, right? So, of course, they did the exact opposite with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, go figure. Now, these games still have some Emerald content, it's just 99% contained within the 2-hour-long Delta episode in the post-game. However, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are more like reimaginings of Hoenn than outright Hoenn remakes. In an interview with GameXplain, Shinichi Masuda and Shigeru Omori expressed that they made these games to feel more like companion pieces to X and Y than purely remakes of the original games. And as such, a ton of the story is reworked and expanded upon, and eventually they just straight up reveal that these games aren't even in the same universe as the originals. Love them or hate them, that's ambitious! They were doing Final Fantasy VII Remake before it was cool! Furthermore, they said this time their primary motivation for making the games was the loud fan support behind them. And it's true, you couldn't even mention the ocean back in 2012 without somebody obnoxiously shouting, "Hoenn confirmed" in the comments section. Believe me, I was there, and you guys were really annoying. And then, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee were really just made to capitalize on Pokemon Go hype, and that's all I really want to say about them. I'm already forcing myself to talk about Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Come on guys, have a little mercy on me. And so, when it was finally Sinnoh's turn to the plate, Game Freak decided, we're just gonna walk him to first base. In their eyes, there was no reason to remake Sinnoh outside of just tradition for remakes at this point. To them, remakes of future games weren't a guaranteed thing. Not unless it was absolutely necessary, as proven with their unwillingness to make Hoenn at first. They would just do them whenever the time felt right. We didn't know this at the time, but some information from the Game Freak Terra leak in 2024 has shed a ton of light on the development of these games. There was a literal leaked slideshow presentation that basically says in plain Japanese, "We never wanted to remake Sinnoh." To be exact, they said, considering the timing, a Diamond and Pearl remake is possible. But we have decided to not do a proper remake using the current technology. With an eye toward the next generation of Pokemon games, Scarlet and Violet is what they're referring to here, We will be challenging ourselves to innovate in both gameplay and technology, creating a technical foundation for future Pokémon titles. While keeping in mind the setting of the original Diamond and Pearl games, this title will break away from the traditional aesthetic and style and be developed as a separate story with a different worldview and gameplay. Okay, I know, that's a lengthy quote, but in case context clues aren't your friend, or you just don't know the general timeline of Pokémon games, they are quite clearly talking about Legends Arceus here. In short, they were more concerned with establishing the baseline for a new era of open-world Pokémon games, while creating a love letter to Sinnoh fans in the process, because even though they didn't want to remake Diamond and Pearl, they acknowledged that it had been 15 years since the original games, and Sinnoh fans were starving for new content. So there you go, Game Freak had no plans to remake Sinnoh, and Legends Arceus basically took the Diamond and Pearl remake's place. Case closed, right? Oh wait, except these games still exist. So, how did we get here? Well, apparently at the last minute, which in the gaming world means only a handful of months before release, Game Freak decided to pivot. They determined that actual remakes of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl were in fact necessary. But the problem was, development of Legends Arceus was already well on its way. And Game Freak's other team had also started development on Scarlet and Violet already. There was literally no bandwidth left to squeeze in a third project. And so, with a measly 15 months until the targeted release date of November 2021, Game Freak contracted the little-known gaming studio Ilka to be the handlers of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Even without the info from the Terra leak, we already knew this to be the case when director Junichi Masuda tweeted out, or zeeted out, or whatever you call it now, this post about wrapping up his work at Ilka in March of 2022, claiming that it had been almost exactly 2 years since he started working there. And I highly doubt Ilka would have started work on these games without their literal director being there, so we can easily infer that March 2020, right smack at the start of a global pandemic, was when these games officially started development. Yep, games that weren't even supposed to exist a few months ago are now being made on a 15-month timeline in the middle of the worst crisis of the 21st century. I'll take Cooked for 500, Alex. Part of the reason behind this decision may have been the fact that 2021 not only served as Diamond and Pearl's 15th anniversary, but also the 25th anniversary of the Pokémon franchise as a whole. Game Freak and the Pokémon Company by extension were probably under a ton of pressure to release a title in the calendar year to keep shareholders happy. And if Legends Arceus, one of their most ambitious titles yet, hit any kind of a snag in its development, it wouldn't be released until 2022. Spoiler alert, that's exactly what happened. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were basically their break glass in case of a very likely emergency games. And to Ilka's credit, it seems like they took the assignment very seriously at first. There's a ton of concept art for these games that reveals their original visions. These games were supposed to look like modern Pokémon games, with full-scaled character models instead of chibis, wide, fleshed-out landscapes instead of recreations of the old grid-based system. I have honestly never seen concept art that looked so radically different from the final product. But it seems that these visions were discarded rather quickly once the cold water hit their faces and they realized the timeline predicament that they were in. Again, only 15 months with all sorts of weirdness on top with the emerging pandemic. COVID absolutely gutted any potential these games had right from the start. As a result, it looks like Game Freak just ended up giving Ilka the straight-up original source code of Diamond and Pearl and told them to make it as faithfully as they possibly could. This wasn't in the Terra leak, but I know this because Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl oddly recreates a lot of typos and glitches that were exclusive to the original Diamond and Pearl. For example, like suction cups having no effect on fishing outside of battle, even though it's supposed to increase your chance of hooking a wild Pokemon. That's something that just wouldn't happen unless they were straight up copying and pasting the code. They also oddly include next to no platinum content. Just a few tiny references to the Distortion world in the post-game is about it. Which, man, can I just say, us not revisiting the Distortion world in these games or Legends Arceus has to be one of the biggest disappointments of the 3D Pokemon era. And there have been a lot of disappointments in the 3D Pokemon era. I mean, maybe they thought since Giratina got to be the star of Legends Arceus at the very end, more so than Arceus itself, I would argue, maybe Game Freak and Ilka thought that we'd have Giratina fatigue, to which I'd say, there's no such thing. But I honestly can't think of any other reason why they'd ignore the bulk of the platinum content. I think even the most die-hard Gen 4 fans can admit that there's a huge variance in quality between the original Diamond and Pearl and Platinum. It might honestly be the biggest difference in quality between any paired games and their enhanced version. But perhaps the distortion world itself was the problem. On such a short timeline, could they have even made the distortion world halfway functional? These games barely made it to the finish line as is. Version 1.0.0 is missing most of the music and even the entire post-game. They were absolutely sweating it out to finish this one on time. Maybe there quite literally wasn't any room for a Platinum expansion. Honestly, I do feel bad for Ilka. I mean, they did create the worst Pokemon games in the last... ever. But these games, and the circumstances that they were created under, basically ruined their image the moment people first heard about them. And it's not entirely their fault given the incredibly short timeline. But now, whenever we hear any mention of Ilka being tied to anything remotely Pokemon related, fans just groan because the only thing we know about them is Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Though, at the very least, some good may have come from this disaster. Other internal documents surfaced after the fallout from the Sinnoh remakes where fans loudly voiced their displeasure. And allegedly, the negative reception to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl may have caused a bit of a paradigm shift for Game Freak. However, please note that what I'm about to read you has not been officially authenticated in any way. Unfortunately, a lot of people just started making fake files and leaks when the real Terra leak was happening, so some of the information from the Terra leak has been exposed as fake. Anyhow, this particular statement reads, remakes for Black and White onwards should have a lot more love and care put into them. We hope that they become good games that will allow people to enjoy eras different from the Legend series. So, if this is real, first of all, bless up, they'll be putting actual effort into my GOAT games. And secondly, it shows that Game Freak now has a different attitude towards remakes as a whole. There's even other files mentioning how Xerneas and Yveltal likely wouldn't get new forms until an eventual X and Y remake. So it appears that Game Freak may finally be acknowledging the necessity of remaking older Pokemon games, and not just treating them as an afterthought or making them purely off of vibes like they have with the last few. But also, if this is true and they're not outsourcing Black and White remakes, then it also means we'll likely be waiting a very long time to get them. I won't tell you which future games were leaked in all of this, but I will say we know what the next handful of years look like, and there is not even a sniff of a Black and White remake yet. Like, literally nothing in the Terra leak even suggested they've started planning it yet. So, sorry to my fellow Unova fans, it's not our turn to yell, Unova confirmed at everyone yet. I mean, that probably won't stop you, but I just thought you should know. But TLDR, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were kinda bad. But also the reasons are a little bit justified. Does it make these games any better? Nope. But do I kinda want to replay them now? Also, nope, I think I'm good. They're just games that nobody wanted to make, and it really shows through in the final product. But hopefully, it gives at least a little bit to look forward to when it comes to Pokemon's next remakes. Maybe we will see something akin to a Fire Red and Leaf Green, a Heart Gold and Soul Silver, or maybe even an Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire in the near future. Just please God no, let's go Johto. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, then be sure to leave a like on this video, it really helps me out, and subscribe for more videos just like this one. I'll see you guys next time.